I remember that day like it was yesterday. I was standing backstage at Lakewood Church. You know, the big one in Texas with the huge crowds and the shiny lights. Joel Osteen's church. There were thousands of people out there. 50,000, maybe more. All waiting for the service to begin. All waiting to hear something that would lift their spirits, give them hope, maybe even change their lives. I had been invited to speak. Me, Jonathan Roumie, the guy who plays Jesus in The Chosen. They wanted me to share my testimony, talk about how God had blessed me through the show, how playing Jesus had brought me success and joy. It sounded like a great opportunity, but deep down, something didn't feel right. As I stood there surrounded by Joel's private security team, I felt calm, not nervous, not scared, just peaceful, like something bigger than me was holding me steady. Then one of the guards, a big guy, strong, reached out to grab my shoulder. His hand was almost there when the head of security stepped forward. He looked me in the eye and said, real quiet, "Mr. Roumie, Pastor Joel has personally requested that you leave the premises immediately." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him and smiled, because I knew something they didn't. I hadn't come to Lakewood to play a part. I hadn't come to smile and say nice things. I had come with a message that needed to be heard, a message that would shake the walls of that church and make people question everything they thought they knew about faith. You see, for 3 months before that day, I had been preparing, not just memorizing lines, not just practicing my role. I had been studying Jesus, the real Jesus, the one who flipped tables in the temple, the one who warned us about wolves in sheep's clothing, the one who said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. I had read the stories, I had prayed, I had listened, and I had learned something powerful, something that most people in that church had never heard before. I had learned what Jesus would do in that exact moment, and it wasn't walk away. So I looked at the guard and I said, "Tell Joel I have a message for his people, and nothing in heaven or earth is going to stop me from delivering it." That moment, right there, was caught on dozens of phones. People recorded it, shared it, millions saw it, and suddenly the whole Christian world was asking one terrifying question. What if everything we've been taught about prosperity and blessing is a lie? What if the promises we hear every Sunday about giving money to get more money aren't from God at all? Let me tell you how it all started. It was a Tuesday morning in September. I got a phone call from Joel Osteen's personal assistant. Her voice was sweet, smooth, like honey. She said, "Mr. Roumie, Pastor Joel would be honored to have you share your testimony at our upcoming service." She made it sound amazing. "Imagine the impact," she said, "when the man who plays Jesus tells 50,000 people about the blessings God has poured into your life." But as she spoke, something inside me stirred. Something didn't feel right. It was like a whisper in my spirit saying, "This isn't about testimony. This is about something else." So I started digging. I spent 3 weeks researching Joel's ministry, his teachings, his lifestyle, and most importantly, the stories of people who had followed his message and ended up broken. I found families who had given their last dollars to Lakewood Church, believing that God would multiply their gift. They thought their sacrifice would bring blessings, but instead they lost their homes, their dreams, everything. I found elderly people who had donated their retirement savings, convinced that God would reward them, but now they were living in poverty while Joel lived in luxury. And then I found Margaret Chen. She was 82 years old, a grandmother, sweet and faithful. For 6 months straight, she sent her entire Social Security check to Lakewood. Every penny, because she believed Joel's promise that her gift would unlock God's financial floodgates, but the flood never came. Margaret died alone in a cold apartment. Her electricity had been cut off. She had given her utility money to the church. Her last words to her granddaughter were heartbreaking. "I thought God would take care of me if I took care of his preacher." That story broke me. It made me realize that this wasn't just about bad theology. It was about real people, real pain, real loss. And I knew I couldn't stay silent, so I accepted the invitation to Lakewood. But not to share a testimony. I came to speak the truth. I came to tell the people that Jesus never promised riches for donations, that faith isn't a business, that blessings aren't bought. I came to remind them that Jesus flipped tables, not counted coins. And when Joel's team tried to stop me, I stood firm. Because I wasn't just an actor playing a role. I was a man who had learned what Jesus would do, and I was ready to do it. That day, everything changed. People started asking questions. They started looking deeper. They started wondering if the gospel they'd been sold was really the gospel of Christ. And that's what I want for you too. I want you to ask questions. I want you to seek truth. I want you to know the difference between shepherds who serve and wolves who devour. Because faith isn't about money. It's about love. It's about sacrifice. It's about following Jesus, even when it's hard. So if you've ever felt like you had to pay to be blessed, if you've ever given more than you could afford, hoping for a miracle, if you've ever wondered why the preacher gets richer while you get poorer, you're not alone. And you're not crazy. You're just waking up. And that's a good thing. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing that God is a vending machine. You can't go back to thinking that faith is a transaction. You start to realize that real faith is messy. It's raw. It's powerful. And it's free. So here I am, telling you what I told Joel's security team. I have a message for the people, and nothing in heaven or earth is going to stop me from delivering it. I want to tell you a story that changed me forever. It started with a letter, a simple note, but the words inside it were heavy, so heavy they broke something in me. The note came from a young woman. Her name was never the headline, but her grandmother's name was Margaret Chen. Margaret was 82 years old. She believed in God. She believed in giving. She believed that if she gave her money to a preacher, God would bless her. So she sent her Social Security checks every month to a church, Lakewood Church, Joel Osteen's church. She gave her heating money, her food money, everything. And then she died, alone, in a cold apartment, no heat, no lights, just silence. Her last words to her granddaughter were, "I thought God would take care of me if I took care of his preacher." That broke me. I play Jesus on TV. People say I look like him, talk like him. But that day, I didn't want to act. I wanted to do what Jesus would do. Because this wasn't just about bad preaching. This wasn't just about wrong ideas. This was about people using Jesus' name to take from the poor, to take from the weak, to take from people like Margaret. And I knew I had to speak. The night before I was supposed to appear at Lakewood, I knelt down in my hotel room. I prayed, not like an actor, not like someone getting ready for a show. I prayed like a man who knew something had to change. I asked God, what would Jesus do if he walked into a church like this today? And the answer came, not in words, but in fire, in conviction, in truth. Jesus wouldn't stay quiet. So the next morning I got dressed. I put the note in my jacket, and I walked into Lakewood Church. Backstage, 3 big security guards surrounded me. They looked nervous. They expected me to be scared, maybe angry, maybe ready to argue. But I was calm. I looked at them with peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from pretending. The kind that comes from knowing you're doing the right thing. One of the guards said, "Mr. Roumie, Pastor Joel has asked us to escort you out. There's been a change of plans." I reached into my jacket. They tensed up. But all I pulled out was that note. I said, "Before I go, I have a message." From Margaret Chen's granddaughter. And I read it. She died believing God abandoned her because Pastor Joel told her that poor people lack faith. She gave her heating money to his ministry and froze to death in her apartment. Please tell people the truth. The room went silent. These guards had seen a lot. Protesters, angry donors, even threats. But they had never seen someone speak with the kind of authority that comes from truth, from love, from justice. I folded the note, looked each of them in the eye. "Gentlemen," I said, "you can remove me. I'll go peacefully. But Margaret Chen died because your boss teaches that poverty is a failure of faith. If you silence her story, you're part of the system that killed her." Then the lead guard's radio crackled. Joel's voice came through, panicked. "Get him out, now before the service starts." But something happened. I didn't get angry. I didn't shout. I smiled, not with pride, not with defiance, but with the same compassion I had learned from playing Jesus. I said, "Tell Joel that Margaret Chen's Jesus is coming to speak for her, and nothing in heaven or earth is going to stop him." Phones were recording, people were watching, and what happened next went viral. Because that moment, when I stood up for Margaret, wasn't just about me. It was about every person who had ever been told that their poverty was their fault, that their suffering was a sign of weak faith. It was about showing the difference between pretending to be Jesus and living like him. The doors to the sanctuary burst open. Joel was on stage telling people that God wanted them to live their best life now. But 50,000 people turned to see me walking down the center aisle. Not with anger, not with a microphone, just with a note and a purpose. The guards didn't stop me. Something had happened backstage, something that made 3 trained men step aside. Joel saw me. His smile froze. The teleprompter kept scrolling, but he couldn't read it. His eyes were locked on mine. Because he knew this wasn't an actor. This was a man who had learned what Jesus would do, and he was doing it. The cameras kept rolling. The live stream didn't cut. Millions watched as I walked toward the stage, and in that moment, the world saw something powerful. They saw that faith isn't about money. It's not about comfort. It's not about making preachers rich. Faith is about truth, about love, about standing up for the least of these. And that day, Margaret Chen's story was heard. Her voice, through her granddaughter's note, was louder than any sermon, and I was just the messenger. I walked onto that stage with no microphone, but somehow my voice carried. It reached every corner of that huge arena, 50,000 people, all eyes on me. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, "my name is Jonathan Roumie, and I have a message from someone who can no longer speak for herself." The crowd clapped. They cheered. They knew who I was. They knew me as the man who plays Jesus on TV. But I raised my hand, and just like that, the cheering stopped. 50,000 people fell silent, not because I was famous, not because I was loud, but because something deeper was happening, something real. Joel Osteen, standing on stage, realized he had lost control of his own service. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a note, a small piece of paper. I held it up so the cameras could see. "This woman," I said, "died believing God had abandoned her because she was poor. Her name was Margaret Chen. She gave her last dollar to this ministry. She believed the promise that if she had faith, God would bless her with money. She believed it so deeply, she gave away her heating money, and she froze to death in her apartment, while the man who took her money lived in a mansion. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. This was a place that usually echoed with promises of wealth and success, but now it was filled with silence, heavy silence. Joel tried to speak, tried to take back control, but his voice cracked. "Jonathan," he said, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." I turned to face him, and in that moment, he wasn't looking at an actor. He was looking at someone who had spent years studying Jesus, someone who had learned not just how to act like him, but how to live like him. "Pastor Joel," I said, "Margaret Chen trusted you with her faith, and you sold it back to her for the price of her heating bill. How many more Margaret Chens have died while you told them that poverty was their fault?" The crowd wasn't quiet anymore. Some people cried, some shouted, some stood up to leave. Others dropped to their knees. The cameras kept rolling. Every moment was captured, broadcasted, shared. And in that moment, everyone watching saw the difference between someone who talks about Jesus and someone who speaks with his authority. But I hadn't come just to expose lies. I had come to offer something far more dangerous to the prosperity gospel: the truth The truth about what Jesus actually promised his followers. And that truth would shake the foundation of everything Lakewood Church had built its fortune on. I stepped to the center of the stage, and I spoke words that I believe will echo for a long, long time. The Jesus I portray owned nothing, I said. He told his followers they would suffer. He said rich men have almost no chance of entering heaven. But the Jesus preached here promises wealth, comfort, success. So I have one question for everyone watching. Which Jesus do you want to follow? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of 50,000 minds wrestling with a truth they had never been allowed to consider. I opened my Bible. It was old, worn, used. And I read the words of Jesus himself. To the rich young ruler, Jesus said, "Sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." That's the real Jesus. Not the one who promises riches for donations. Not the one who says your bank account proves your faith. But the one who walks with the poor, the broken, the forgotten. The one who flips tables when people turn faith into profit. So I ask you again, which Jesus do you want to follow? I stood on that stage looking out at 50,000 people. No microphone, no script, just truth. I opened my Bible and read the words of Jesus. "Then come, follow me." And the man walked away sad because he had great wealth. I turned to Joel Osteen. His face was pale. Sweat poured down his forehead. His empire was shaking. "Pastor Joel," I asked, "when was the last time you preached that verse?" He tried to push back. "Jonathan, you're taking that out of context." But I didn't let him finish. "Then let's add context," I said. I read again. Jesus looked at his disciples and said, "How hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." The crowd erupted. Some people cried. Some shouted. Some stormed out. Others dropped to their knees. These were people who had been told that God wanted them rich, that being poor meant they lacked faith, that their bank account was a measure of their belief. But now the man who played Jesus was telling them something different, something true. I turned to the cameras. Millions were watching. "For 3 years," I said, "I've studied Jesus Christ, not just to act like him, but to understand him. I've read every word he spoke, studied every step he took, learned every lesson he taught. And here's what I found. Jesus never promised wealth. He promised persecution. He never said faith would make life easy. He said it would cost everything. He never taught that money equals blessing. He warned that storing up treasures on earth leads to spiritual death. The truth hung in the air. Heavy, real. Margaret Chen believed the lie. She thought her poverty meant God didn't love her. But Jesus, he was born in a stable. He had no home. He died owning nothing but the clothes on his back. He washed the feet of poor fishermen. He ate with sinners and tax collectors. The Jesus of the Bible wouldn't have been welcome at Lakewood Church. He'd be too poor to belong. Joel tried one last time to take back control. "But Jonathan," he said, "God wants his children to prosper." I looked at him, calm, compassionate, but firm. "Pastor Joel," I said, "if God wanted his children to prosper financially, why did he allow his own son to be born in poverty, live in poverty, and die in poverty? Why did he choose fishermen, not businessmen? Why did Jesus say, 'Blessed are the poor in spirit,' instead of, 'Blessed are the wealthy in faith'?" Then I held up Margaret Chen's note. One last time. This woman died believing she lacked faith because she lacked money. But the truth is, she had more faith than anyone in this building. She gave everything she had, just like the widow with her 2 coins. And Jesus praised her. But he never told her that her gift would come back multiplied. That was the final blow, not to Joel, but to the lie. The lie that faith is about money. The lie that poverty is failure. The lie that God's love can be measured in dollars. And in that moment, the crowd didn't see an actor. They saw a man who had learned how to speak like Jesus. And more importantly, how to live like him. She gave everything she had. Margaret Chen didn't have much, just a small check each month, just enough to keep the lights on, just enough to stay warm. But she gave it all to a church that promised her blessings, to a preacher who said her money would unlock miracles, and she died cold, alone, in the dark. But her faith was real. Jesus saw it. He told us, the widow who gave 2 coins gave more than all the rich men combined, because she gave from her heart, and Margaret did too. That's what I told the crowd. That's what I said on that stage. And what happened next? No one could have predicted. Because truth, real truth, has power that money can't buy. And when people hear the real words of Jesus, not the polished promises, not the sugar-coated sermons, but the actual truth, everything changes. The crowd didn't just listen, they woke up. 50,000 people, all at once. Some cried, deep, painful sobs, realizing they'd been lied to for years. Others pulled out their phones, right there in their seats, canceling their monthly donations to Lakewood Church. Hundreds stood up, walked to the glass doors, and started handing money not to the church, but to homeless people outside. It was like watching the book of Acts come alive. But the most shocking moment? Joel Osteen's own worship team. They stopped playing, put down their instruments, walked off the stage. The lead singer grabbed the mic and said words that would be replayed millions of times. We can't keep singing about a Jesus who promises wealth when the real Jesus promised suffering. We quit. And then, one by one, Lakewood staff started removing their name tags. Quietly, calmly, they walked toward the exits, leaving Joel alone. Alone on the stage he had built, a stage made of promises, promises that had just been exposed as lies. He stood frozen, watching his empire collapse. And then, desperate, he ran to the microphone. "Security!" he screamed. "Cut the cameras. This is my church. I own this place." But it was too late. The cameras were rolling. The world was watching, and the mask was gone. No more gentle smiles. No more soft words. Just a man whose greed had finally been exposed. And the damage? It was done. Because once people see the truth, they can't unsee it. Once they hear the real Jesus, the one who walked with the poor, who warned the rich, who said, "Take up your cross," they can't go back to the fake one. And that day wasn't just a moment. It was the start of a movement that would change Christianity forever. Phones were everywhere, recording, streaming, sharing. Social media exploded. The hashtag #RealJesus was spreading faster than Joel Osteen's team could control. News outlets picked it up. Headlines rolled in. And Christian leaders around the world were suddenly faced with a choice. Would they defend the message of wealth and comfort? Or would they stand with the Jesus who walked with the poor? I walked calmly toward the exit. My mission was complete. But just before I stepped off the stage, I turned back one last time. Joel was still standing there, alone, surrounded by empty chairs. His staff had walked out. His audience wasn't clapping anymore. I looked at him, not with anger, not with pride, but with truth. "Pastor Joel," I said, "Margaret Chen forgave you before she died. She told her granddaughter she hoped God would help you see the truth someday. Today is that day." And then I asked the question that hung in the air like thunder. "What are you going to do with it?" The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of a man's soul being weighed. Joel Osteen had spent years building his empire. But now, for the first time, he had to ask himself if it was built on sand. And what happened next? That was just the beginning. Because when real Christianity stands up to the kind that's built on money and comfort, the shock waves don't stop at one church. They ripple through everything. The next 24 hours would prove that. At 3 a.m., my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. But the voice, I knew it instantly. It was Joel. He was crying, broken, barely able to speak. "Jonathan," he whispered, "I can't sleep. I can't eat. Every time I close my eyes, I see Margaret Chen's face. What have I done? What have I become? That call, it wasn't just a moment of regret. It was a confession, and someone close to Joel leaked it. The world heard a side of him no one had ever seen. I started believing my own lies, Joel said. I convinced myself that God wanted me rich, that the blessings proved I was right. But last night, sitting alone in my mansion, I realized something terrifying. I've become everything Jesus warned about. I'm the rich man who can't enter heaven because I love money more than truth. And then he told me something that shook me to my core. There's a recording, Joel said, a tape I made years ago when my father was dying. He told me the truth about our ministry, about how we use people's faith to fund our lifestyle. He begged me to change, to preach the real gospel. That tape, it could change everything, not just for Joel, but for every preacher, every church, every believer who's ever wondered if the gospel they've been taught is the one Jesus actually preached. And now, the world was watching. I recorded everything, not because I planned to use it, but because deep down I knew the truth might matter someday. I buried it, hid it, chose money over honesty. But now I want the world to hear it. I want people to know what prosperity preaching really costs. 3 days after that call, the tape was released, and it shook the church world to its core. It was Joel's father, Joel Osteen, speaking from his deathbed. "Son," he said, "we've turned Jesus into a vending machine. Put in faith. Get out money." But that's not the gospel. That's spiritual fraud. Promise me you'll tell people the truth. Following Jesus costs everything and guarantees nothing except his presence in your suffering. That tape spread like wildfire. Within a week, 12 of the biggest prosperity preachers in America announced they were rethinking their message. People stopped giving to flashy ministries. Instead, donations to real Christian charities, ones helping the poor, jumped by 400%, and something beautiful happened. Joel gave $10 million to start the Margaret Chen Foundation. It helps families who were hurt by prosperity theology. Families like Margaret's, people who gave everything, hoping for miracles, and ended up with nothing. But the biggest change? It happened in homes, living rooms, kitchens, quiet places where people sat down and finally heard the truth. God's love isn't for sale. Faith isn't measured by money, and Jesus never promised wealth. He promised himself, and for millions of people, that was more than enough. I didn't just expose one preacher. I helped start a revolution, a movement that proved truth has power money can't buy. So if you've ever been told your struggles mean you lack faith, if you've ever given money you couldn't afford, hoping for a miracle, if you've ever wondered why the rich seem blessed while the faithful suffer, then hear me now. Share this message. Drop truth in the comments if you're ready to follow the real Jesus, not the profitable one. Subscribe because this revolution is just beginning. We're exposing every false teacher who puts profit over prophecy. The age of buying God's favor is over. The age of authentic faith is here. Jesus said, "Freely you have received, freely give." That's not just about money. That's the foundation of real Christianity. Everything God offers is free, and anyone charging for it is selling something Jesus never approved. Margaret Chen died believing a lie, but her story, it's saving millions. The revolution starts now. Join us, because authentic faith changes everything, and it doesn't cost a penny.